if we're looking at our functional behavior assessment, this is kind of the process that we go through. So we start with this thing called an indirect assessment, and that's usually where somebody like me sits down with you and asks you a whole bunch of questions and asks you to describe things, and I get a whole bunch of information from you, okay? From there, then we move on to direct observations, where again, someone like me usually comes in and does some observations and writes some stuff down, or I might ask you to do some observations and write some stuff down. Or in this pandemic, people have been doing direct observation via video or even via live feed, right, through Zoom, right, and just having a family put up their camera so that we can see what's going on, so we can get some of that data. And then sometimes as well, a professional might come in and do what's called a functional analysis, which may or may not be necessary, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So in terms of an indirect assessment, if you're a parent and you're getting behavior consultation services, this is where somebody should start in terms of understanding problematic behavior. They should start with an interview, about an hour to 2, and essentially the goal here is to get information from you. If we're talking about a home setting, if we're talking about school, then from the school staff or whoever the relevant people are. We're looking for a description of the problem behavior. So I need to know, if I'm coming in, what it is that I'm looking for in terms of problematic behavior. What is it that's concerning? Then I want to get some information about some environmental factors, right? So I want to know about physical factors. I want to know about environmental factors that might influence behavior. And I'm going to give you some examples of what those might be in just a little bit. I want to try and identify the function of behavior, and I'll come up with some hypotheses even during that interview, and I'll sort of bounce my hypotheses off and say, well, does it kind of seem as though? And I'll sort of say, there may be, this is about getting you to come and play with them. Or is this about, getting access to the iPad that, when they do these behaviors, it's because they want the iPad. And I'll bounce off some hypotheses and see, what the parents, for example, say in terms of, yeah, actually, that does sound about right. Or no, it goes a different way, right? So it's about me kind of trying to get a basic understanding of what's going on. So when we're thinking about behavior, I want to know things like, what does the behavior look like? How often do they occur? How long might an episode last? Are we talking about, tantrums that last for a really long time? And what kind of behaviors occur during those tantrums? I also want to know about intensity. So are we talking about behaviors that are damaging or destructive? Because certainly if I'm needing to prioritize what kinds of things to focus on first, I want to usually focus on making sure that people are safe and that they're not being harmed, right? That's my first priority. I want to ask about these things called setting events. So we talked about the possibility that you hopefully mediated some of your setting events this morning by, getting coffee. Maybe you're still in your nice comfy jammies and your fuzzy slippers because those are comfy things, and it makes sitting and watching a screen all day easier. And so you're more likely to sort of chill out and hang in with me. And so you've managed some of those setting events for yourself. When I'm doing a functional behavior assessment, the kinds of things that I'm asking about in terms of setting events for a child or an older individual, if I'm working with a youth or adult, I want to know if the person's taking any medications and if they might have side effects that might affect how they feel physically. I want to know about any medical problems that might affect particularly how they feel physically. I want to know about things like sleep cycles. Is this person tired? How many of us are more likely to engage in problematic behaviors, right? Because we all engage in problematic behaviors if we're tired, right? I know I do. If I haven't had enough sleep, I'm not very friendly, okay? I want to know about eating routines and diet, right? Is this person eating a diet that's not very nutritious, and might that be affecting how they feel, right? Do they have food allergies maybe that are affecting how they feel? I want to know about their daily schedule and how predictable that schedule is. Do they actually know what's happening from like 1 minute to the next across their day? I want to know if they have choices. Do they have a schedule that's kind of designed by someone else, and someone else is telling them everything that they have to do every single day, and they really never get to have much of a say in what they do? That might be part of the problem, right? So I want to know, how many choices does this person have? I want to know how many other people are in the environment and whether or not this person is bothered by that. Some of us love crowded environments. We love being around lots of activity, and some of us do not. And if we've got a person who really doesn't like environments with lots of people, but mostly spend their time in environments with lots of people, we see that there's a mismatch there. Or sometimes we might see that there's a mismatch between sort of just a personality style of the staff versus the child. So we might have a child who really likes kind of gregarious and woohoo kind of support staff, and they've got a more neutral, kind of calm, relaxed support staff. And that just might not be a really good match. And so we might need to look at making some changes. And that doesn't necessarily mean changing out the staff, but it might mean the staff learning to be a bit more sort of exciting and upbeat, because that's a better fit with what the kid needs, okay? I want to think about things like staffing patterns. So particularly if I'm talking about a school situation, is this a situation where staffing is maybe inconsistent? Educational assistants are rotating in and out often during the day, and maybe the kid doesn't know who's coming and going, and the change is just too abrupt. Once I get the setting events parts done, I want to think towards antecedents, right? And so remember, antecedents are like these triggers, right? You're lighting the match to start the fire. This is what predicts whether or not behavior will occur. So while these setting events, so things like coffee, that's not a guarantee if you don't have coffee that you're going to engage in problematic behavior, but it just pushes you a little closer to the edge. The antecedents are the things that kick you over the edge, okay? So these are the things that cause problem behavior to occur. And so we want to know about things that predict. So is it related to time of day, right? Some of us are not good in the morning, and some of us are not good at night. Like, night is totally my time. I am awake at night. Morning, not so much. Places or physical setting, right? So we need to know about, are there things within a physical setting that are problematic? Think about schools and fluorescent lights. And I don't know about you, I'm not really a fan of fluorescent lights, but there are fluorescent lights all over school. And so sometimes there's an aspect of the physical environment, or there's noise coming in from another part of the environment that's really bothersome. What about people? Are there specific people that seem to be associated with problematic behavior? Activities. Are there specific activities that are associated with problem behavior? Where asking a child to do a particular kind of task is, almost always associated with problematic behavior, whereas other tasks are almost never associated with problem behavior. We want to know those things too. And then we want to think about things like task demands, asking people to do certain things. Does that sort of light the fire? Interruptions. Really engaged and engrossed in an activity, and somebody comes and interrupts me, and not only do they interrupt me, but they interrupt me to tell me I have to stop and go do something else, and that something else is not nearly as enjoyable. Is that a problem, right? It's a problem for me. I don't enjoy being interrupted when I'm enjoying something, right? Transitions, having to move from one activity to the next, right? At home, sometimes that happens, right? Like it's time to stop playing and go to dinner, or stop playing and go to bed. It happens a lot in schools, right? Stop this activity, move to the next activity, move to the next activity. And for some kids, those transitions seem really abrupt and fast, okay? We want to know about things like delays, having to wait for things, right? None of us like to wait. We're all really tired of waiting for the day where we can roam about freely again. We're getting really tired of that. And the longer we have to wait, the harder it is for some people, especially, right? And so I think it's important to recognize that. And then finally, lack of attention, right? So there are lots of individuals who really enjoy interaction, okay? This idea that individuals with autism don't like interaction and prefer to be alone all the time across the board, that's a myth, right? That's not the case for everybody. And it's not the case for anyone, that people do or don't like attention. Some of us like lots of attention and interaction. people are in the middle, and then others are on the other end of things. And we need to understand what the child's preferences are and whether or not their preferences are matched by what's actually happening. So if this is a person who does like attention and interaction, and when there isn't attention and interaction, like a teacher is busy doing something or a parent is busy doing something, is that something that is likely to trigger problematic behavior? Because they're, hold on a second, nobody's here with me. I'd like to have someone here with me, and I engage in behavior so that someone comes running, okay? Once I've got a sense of those antecedents, then I start thinking about consequences. And I want to identify the things that happen after a problematic behavior occurs. And I want to see, are there things that the person gets, whether it's an item or an activity or a person engages with them, or are they avoiding or delaying something? Are they avoiding an activity that they don't like? Are they delaying a transition, right? What's kind of going on and what's the payoff for them? And that's going to help me understand that function. I also want to know about the efficiency of their behaviors, or essentially how well does that behavior work for them? Do they get what they want right away, every time, all the time? Do they have to put out a lot of physical effort or a little physical effort? Part of the reason I want to know this is that later on, when I start thinking about interventions, I want to make sure that if I'm teaching a kid to do something differently, that what I'm teaching them to do is easier than their problematic behavior, right? Because kind of no fair saying, here's a problematic behavior and it's really easy. And I don't want you to do that, but I want you to do this really difficult thing instead. That's not fair, right? So the new thing I want to teach has to be at least equal in terms of difficulty, but ideally even easier, right? I don't want to make the kid do something that's even harder than what they already know how to do, okay? I also want to ask some questions when I'm doing my assessment about communication abilities, because lots of times problem behavior serves to communicate messages. So sometimes we're talking about kids whose communication skills are still developing, right? So they may not be using speech really well, and they may be using lots of other ways to communicate that we're not really recognizing as communication. So it's important to think about that. But I want to know, how does this child communicate right now? Can this person communicate in whatever form they do consistently? So if they do use speech, is their speech consistent, or is it kind of a once in a blue moon situation? So it's not very reliable yet. Can they communicate specific messages? Do they understand verbal requests? So if you ask them to do something, or if you give them information, do they actually understand you? Because if they don't understand you, we're going to need to give them information in a different way. Again, it's not fair to expect, well, you don't understand what I'm saying, but you need to follow what I'm saying. If you don't understand what I'm saying, I need to provide you some additional information that will help you understand. I want to know things like imitation skills. Can the person imitate? Because maybe I might be teaching the person to point to things, or I might be teaching a couple of signs, or I might be teaching other kinds of communication skills, and I'm going to model, and I want to know if they can imitate. And if they can't imitate, then modeling isn't going to be a good strategy for me. I want to know if they can follow, if they use at all, signed requests. Right? So if I were to sign something to them, do they understand? Or if they're not using sign language, what about gestures? Do they understand if I point that it means to go that way? Do they understand things like head nods and shakes? So those kinds of things. And at the end of the day, I also want to know, how does the person communicate yes and no? Do they have a yes and no response? Do they have a way of saying that? Because at the very least, if I offer something up and ask, do you want this? I want to know, well, how would they tell me that they do or they don't? Okay, and so I want to know, where are they at right now? Other things that I ask parents, if I'm interviewing parents about, is how do you make sure that activities go well? What do you do to make sure that everything goes along perfectly? And people can usually tell me this, right? They can say, do this, do this, do this, and don't do this, right? So how do you make sure things go well, and what should you avoid doing, right, so that you don't set off any problems? I also want to know what the person likes, right? What are some things that the person likes that we might be able to use as reinforcement to help a person know that what they're doing is good, right? So are there food items that the person really likes? Toys and objects, specific activities at home, or activities or outings in the community, or anything else that the person enjoys, okay? So that's a really important thing. And then finally, I want to know, what have you tried in the past? Have you tried anything in the past, and how did it go? I certainly don't want to repeat any previous interventions that were ineffective. I want to make sure that I don't do things that we already know aren't going to go well. So I want to know what's happened in the past, and if something hasn't worked, I want to try and figure out, well, why hasn't it worked? And is it because the intervention wasn't a good intervention, or is it because the intervention was too challenging, or what's the issue, so that I don't make the same mistakes that perhaps have been made before. An indirect assessment helps us form some hypotheses about behavior and why that behavior is happening. So it tells us what are the things that trigger that behavior, what are the things that pay off behavior, what are those setting events that push the person to the edge. This is an example from my doctoral research where I trained a number of deaf individuals coming from a background in deaf education with a deaf staff person that I had trained going in to work with a family for an agency, and she worked for an agency that supported deaf children. The parents in this case study were mom and dad. Mom was the primary support person. She was a homemaker at home. Dad worked outside of the home and provided support when he wasn't working. And then Kieran was the child. Kieran was an 8-year-old deaf child, also diagnosed with autism and cerebral palsy. And his problem behaviors included noncompliance, physical interference and resistance, negative vocalizations, and food refusal. So his functional assessment showed that he engaged in a bunch of problematic behaviors that his parents found to be problematic. He would sign no, he would whine, he would yell. He would engage in noncompliance. He would essentially ignore his parents' requests. He would leave the assigned area when asked to do something, engage in physical interference, push his parents' hand away. The antecedents essentially were being asked to engage in a specific task, like doing his homework or eating or going for a bath. Parent provided physical assistance to complete tasks, so if a parent tried to help him with a task. And then finally, a parent request to stop engaging in a specific task to do something else. In terms of maintaining consequences, it was mostly for this child around escape. He would either escape a task, he'd escape eating non-preferred foods, he'd escape transitions to other tasks. The setting event suggested that for him, he didn't have a lot of predictability about what was going on in his day-to-day life. He didn't have a lot of choice in his daily activities. Things were quite structured for him. If he was tired, and he was a child who didn't sleep well generally, and he had a very long school day, he was picked up to go to school by the bus quite early. He was the first pickup, and he was the last drop-off. So he had really long days. He had physical fatigue often. As a child with cerebral palsy, he pushed his own wheelchair. He commando crawled in his household, so he sort of crawled on the floor that way. And so if he was physically fatigued, he was more likely to engage in problematic behavior. And he had some degree of poor nutrition. He was quite underweight, and it was due to his food refusal behavior. He really had a very limited repertoire of foods that he would eat, and it was interfering with his overall physical health. So the consultant identified 3 problematic routines in collaboration with the family. Transition from sort of independent playtime to the bath. And the reason that this was particularly important was because he was getting older, and mom was usually at home alone when dad was at work, trying to do the evening before bed bath. And when he was smaller, mom could just pick him up and take him to the bath. And now that he was getting bigger and longer, mom couldn't carry him as easily, and she was starting to sustain back injuries. And so it was really important for her that she could sort of get a handle on how to get him to transition to bath when it was time for him to have a bath and then go to bed. Transitioning off the computer was another routine identified by the family. So when the family said, you know, it's time to stop computer and we're going to do something else now, That was problematic. And then finally, because of food refusal, eating dinner, and not just eating the food, but sitting with the family and participating in that family meal. So at the end of the indirect assessment, the consultant identified some hypotheses about the problematic behavior in each of those routines. And so what I'm going to show you today is just the transition to bath piece. And so when the consultant put together a hypothesis, here are the setting events that were identified. So that lack of predictability. Don't know what the expectations are, don't know what the transitions are. Lack of choice, being tired, being physically fatigued, having poor nutrition. The antecedent in this case, the parent coming and essentially interrupting him at play to say it's time to go to your bath now. For behavior, he would engage in some negative vocalizations, right? So he'd yell, or he'd sign, no, 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 no. Essentially, right, non-compliance, not following parent instruction. He would leave the assigned area in that he would kind of go in the opposite direction of the bathroom, so he'd try to go somewhere else. And if mom tried to sort of physically guide him to the bathroom, he'd physically interfere, so he'd try to swat her hands away and things like that. And the maintaining consequence for him is that he would escape that independent transition to bath. So either mom would carry him, or he just wouldn't get a bath, because if mom was too tired, if her back was really hurting, she would just kind of go, you know what, I can't do it, okay? So that's the way the situation was looking. And that was sort of the hypothesis about, you know, why this was an issue and what function it served for Kieran.